And so when we look at, say, the Gospel of Mark, you'll see that it's dated at 70 AD. Interesting. Why?
All right, let's see it.
Because all the critical scholarship knows it's so amazingly accurate about the fall of Jerusalem in the Rome-Jewish War when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. So hang on, it must have been written around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. It's just too accurate. Okay? That's how they look at it.
So this commentary fundamentally misunderstands and misrepresents the actual position of critical scholarship on the dating of the Gospel of Mark. The scholars are actually more or less split on whether Mark was written just before the destruction of the temple in the summer of 70 CE or just after. And I think the argument is actually stronger for the Gospel of Mark being written just before the destruction of the temple in the summer of 70 CE. And its dating to the late 60s actually goes back to our earliest traditions about when it was written. Because in the 2nd century CE, we have some anti-Marcionite prologues to the Gospels. And the anti-Marcionite prologue to the Gospel of Mark says that it was written after the death of Peter, which tradition assigns to the mid-60s CE, probably under the persecutions orchestrated by the Emperor Nero. But let's take a look at what the scholarship actually has to say about the accuracy of the Olivet Discourse, and then what that means to dating. Here is Joel Marcus's commentary on Mark 1 through 8 from the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary Series, one of the leading critical commentary series in the world. The highlighted section begins, "The position adopted here is that for Mark and his community, the abomination of desolation, which is the occupation of the temple by the Zealots in 67 to 68, and the flight of the Christians from Jerusalem shortly thereafter are events of the recent past. For these events appear to have inaugurated the time of great tribulation in which Mark and his addressees feel themselves to be now living. It is more difficult to pin down Mark's chronological relation to the temple destruction in 70. Is this an event that he and his readers know has already happened, or is it merely one that they anticipate will occur very shortly? On the one hand, in favor of a pre-70 dating is the probability that Jesus actually prophesied the temple's destruction, as did other Jewish prophets down through the centuries. A prophecy of its end, therefore, would not require a post-70 date, and one would not even need prophetic powers to see that the temple would probably end up being reduced to the rubble by the Romans once the Jewish rebels had occupied it in 67 to 68, and the Romans had begun preparations for besieging Jerusalem shortly thereafter. The case for a pre-70 dating might be strengthened by the observation that the prophecy in Mark 13, 1 through 2 does not exactly correspond to what happened. Even after the destruction in 70 CE, there were still some stones left standing upon other stones in the temple compound. Indeed, they are still standing there today, nearly 2,000 years later, as anyone who has visited the Wailing Wall in the old city of Jerusalem knows. These standing stones, to be sure, are from the foundation and retaining wall of the edifice, not from the temple proper, but the unnuanced nature of the Mark and Jesus' language, not one stone, might still be considered an argument against a post-destruction dating for the gospel. Moreover, Mark makes no mention of the huge fire that actually precipitated the temple's collapse, even though this fire features prominently in post-70 accounts of the war. Let's take a look at this Sacra Pagina commentary on the Gospel of Mark by Donahue and Harrington. The highlighted section says, "So the early patristic tradition, the content of Mark's Gospel, and events at Rome in the late 60s of the 1st century CE all point to Rome around 70 CE as the historical setting for the origin of Mark's Gospel. Whether it was composed shortly before or shortly after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE is not clear." Then we can go to Robert Gulick's Word Biblical Commentary on Mark 1 through 8:26. Mark 13 has been used to support both a pre-war and post-war dating, but a detailed analysis of Mark 13:14 set against the historical background of the war in 67 to 70 shows that the events associated in much of the current scholarship with the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple simply do not fit with this verse that contains both a reference to the abomination of desolation and the note about fleeing into the hills. Yet, since Mark places the discourse of 13:3 through 37 in the context of the predicted fall of the temple, and as the answer to the question about when these things, including the predicted destruction of the temple, would take place, 1314 fits more appropriately a setting preceding the destruction of the temple in AD 67 to 69, when the evangelist could foresee the impending doom of Jerusalem and the temple. Then we can look at Adela Yarbrough Collins's Hermeneia commentary on Mark. Hermeneia is one of the other two leading critical commentaries, and we have 4 pages of discussion on dating that you can check out, and I want to highlight the very end. Thus, the Gospel according to Mark was probably composed after Menachem began to exercise a messianic role in 66 CE, or more likely after 68 or 69, when Simon, son of Gioras, emerged as the major messianic leader of the revolt. These are the best candidates for the interpretation of the remark of the Mark in Jesus, "Many will come in my name," in 13:6. Since the desolating sacrilege and the destruction of the temple still seem to belong to the future from the point of view of the evangelist, the gospel was probably written before 70 CE. And then we can go to the New Testament Library, another leading critical commentary. Eugene Boring's commentary on Mark has this comment: "By any reckoning, this was a tumultuous time for the empire, for Judaism, and for the new Christian community. Serious earthquakes occurred in 60 and 63. The Roman army suffered defeat at the hands of the Parthians on the eastern border of the empire in 62. In 64, Roman Christians became scapegoats for the disastrous fire that destroyed much of the inner city of Rome. They were rounded up and put to death in the most cruel ways. Both Peter and Paul probably died in this purge. Other Christian leaders had been martyred by the time Mark was written. Nero committed suicide in 68, and struggles for the emperor's throne ensued, with 3 emperors within 1 year. Meanwhile, the Roman army put down a revolt in Palestine in a bloody war that devastated the region and destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. During the siege, the commanding general became emperor, and his son completed the war, burned the temple, and carried its sacred objects through the streets of Rome in a triumphal procession. At some point in this chaotic time, Mark was written. The readers live in the time when the holy city and temple had just been destroyed, or when its destruction was imminent and certain. More precise than this, we cannot be." And then you can also look at Darrell Bock's New Cambridge Bible Commentary on Mark. He doesn't really commit to a specific dating, but spends several pages sharing other commentators' positions, and pretty much universally scholars are in agreement that it took place somewhere between around 65 and 75 CE. And the fact that the prophecies are not accurate is one of the things that leads scholars to date them to before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And as you can see, critical scholars are not saying, wow, it's way too accurate, it had to have been written after the fact. They're saying, it's not that accurate, it could have been written before the fact, when everybody realized the destruction of the temple was pretty much imminent.
The critical scholars know that the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, is about the fall of Jerusalem. So if it was written after the event, then it's one of two things. It has nothing to do with the fall of Jerusalem, okay? And this is the same contention about Revelation. If it was written after the event, and clearly all the historical allusions to the fall of Jerusalem, why the authors put that in there, it must be related to something else.
This is not accurate. Even if it was written shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, the message is that the fall of Jerusalem is one of the signs that the second coming is imminent, is about to happen. And so readers in the months and years following the destruction of Jerusalem will say, oh, that just happened. Okay, time to take this seriously. It ratchets up the stakes and the immediacy of the second coming, of the end of the world, and it evokes an emotional response in the audience, in the readership, which is precisely the rhetorical point of these prophecies. This is supposed to make them feel like this is imminent, and if it points to something that they know recently happened, then that just ratchets everything up. So yes, there is a perfectly rational rhetorical function to referring in the text to something that happened in the audience's past. The notion that it can't have referred to that because that already happened, therefore it must refer to something else, is pure and utter nonsense.
But if it's written before, it's showing prophetic fulfillment about what Jesus said was going to happen.
This is also not accurate. What it shows is that People understood this was imminent, this was almost certainly going to happen. And as I have shown, the critical scholarship points out the fact that the predictions were not very accurate is a good indicator that this was the author of the Gospel of Mark making a prediction about what was about to happen and getting it right in the main strokes, but getting the details wrong. So this betrays two problems with an awful lot of biblical apologetics. On the one hand, apologists are not very familiar with the critical scholarship. What happens is they become familiar with caricatures of the critical scholarship that are developed precisely so that they can be easily torn down. And that's what circulates from apologist to apologist. And if they have credentials because they went to school and got a PhD in something, they are presumed to be experts on this, even though a big problem with a lot of evangelical apologists, problems that evangelical scholars themselves have been pointing out for many years. And you can go check out Kenton Sparks' book, God's Word in Human Words, for an example of a critique of this practice. A lot of evangelical apologists go through programs that don't require they directly or thoroughly engage the critical scholarship. They intentionally sidestep that direct engagement. Many times it's because they perceive it to be a threat to their faith. Other times they just are interested in the credential so that they can then speak authoritatively about issues about which they do not have training. And so we have a lot of apologists, some credentialed, some not, who are misrepresenting the critical scholarship, but because they have either become popular apologists or because they may have credentials that didn't require they actually directly engage the critical scholarship, they misunderstand and they misrepresent it, which is very clearly what's going on here. And the other problem that this rhetoric exposes is the fact that apologists tend not to be very creative or insightful when they're trying to explain the reasons for circumstances. Everything gets reduced down to whatever best serves their rhetorical goals, which is always to dismiss critical scholarship. So in this example, the notion that if it was written in the months or weeks or years after the destruction of the temple, it clearly cannot have been referring to the destruction of the temple. That's nonsensical. The notion that if it was written in the weeks or months or even years prior to the destruction of the temple, but still within the war with Rome, then it must be prophetic fulfillment, which is also absolute nonsense. And as an example of the inconsistent methodologies that apologists apply to these questions, we might ask this apologist if Joseph Smith had prophetic insight. Decades before the Civil War began in South Carolina, Joseph Smith predicted that a civil war would begin on the question of slavery in South Carolina. Was that prophetic insight and prophetic fulfillment, or was that just a good guess based on what everybody was expecting to happen? Obviously, not every prediction that occurs before an event is prophetic insight, and particularly when they don't get all the details right. And this apologist has not gotten many of the details right when it comes to critical scholarship or when it comes to the best explanations for the circumstances as we find them in the Gospel of Mark. And the fit for this video has been the X-Men '97 cartoon.